Elizabeth Yin published this thread last week, and if you're a startup founder, you should pay attention. Elizabeth is a VC, a manager at a Hustle Fund. She's invested in over 700 startups, including us as part of 500 startups. In a nutshell, everybody today is struggling for capital, and the outcome doesn't seem too bright for next year. You're going to see a lot of startups close shop in the coming months, not because their products or their business models are flawed, but because their founders don't know how to operate in a bad fundraising environment. When money flows, like in 2021, you can always rely on a new round of funding to keep your company afloat as long as you're growing. But suddenly, the companies that are most valuable today are not those fast growers, but the companies that have a runway. Ideally, the companies that can operate profitably. The companies that are capital intensive, who need a lot of cash to continue operating today, have either died or have had no choice but to raise down rounds. And you're gonna hear this phrase a lot in the next few months. Down round. A down round is when a company raises money at a lower valuation than their previous round. And it's a terrible deal for investors and an even worse deal for the founders. It means a lot of dilution. We've seen the other end of this stick on Slidebean, where our pitch deck writing business has slowed down while our financial planning services have skyrocketed. So the most critical thing that you have to do as a founder, as a CEO, a COO, a CFO, is to make sure that your math is solid, that you understand what drives your revenue and how it can be affected in the coming months, while you understand your expenses and ensure that you don't have any surprises with the expenses from next month. So in this video, I want to share some of the best practices, some of the best tactics that we've used on our own projections and in our own customers' spreadsheets to turn a budget spreadsheet into something more like a Palantir, something that can predict next year's profits with a small margin of error. All right, so let's start with the very, very basics, which is understanding drivers. If there's one thing I want to carve into your brain with this video, is this concept of drivers. What drives your revenue? A lot of companies just don't have a clear answer to that question. And that becomes very, very dangerous. Your conversions might be driven by your paid marketing or by your sales team. And if you have a good understanding of that driver, if that driver is under control, increasing budget directly translates into growth on the other end. Those are those direct drivers. But there are more abstract drivers, like organic traffic. That could be SEO or word of mouth, or maybe your PR efforts. Now they're real as well. Entire companies have been built just on those drivers. The problem is that you can't directly control them or affect them. While there are teams and budgets that drive them, and you can certainly track how much they cost, there's just no direct connection. For example, if you double your SEO team, you're not gonna get double the traffic right away. It might not happen at all because that's just not the way SEO works. Now, the important part about understanding your drivers is this causality. Money spent on paid marketing should be directly proportional to sales, while money spent on your SEO team is not. Now, on a potential budget cut, it's really crucial that you understand which driver is which. Which of these drivers are directly connected to your revenue, and therefore you can't cut. But if you want to get really serious about understanding, about projecting for the future, you can run this exercise. You can go back in time and try and understand what your cost of acquisition is. So in this case, we're looking at the last 6 months of data and your marketing spend and the number of customers that came directly from those campaigns. It's important to isolate them. It's not any customer, it's the customers that you know were driven by those campaigns. But if you have those data points correct, you can find a cost of acquisition. And you can use that cost of acquisition to predict for the future. In this case, cost of acquisition has revolved for the last 6 months at around $60. I've been on the phone for hours with companies that have no idea what these numbers are. They're not tracking them. They don't understand them. But understanding them is absolutely key. Let me show you why. Now, if you bring up a spreadsheet, you can begin to connect that marketing budget to conversions using that cost of acquisition. So it's not an unreasonable assumption to say that our historical cost of acquisition will hold up for the future. If you do the 3-month average of this, it's been holding steady at around 63. So it's not a crazy assumption to assume that that can hold on for the future. And it's an educated guess. And then when you have a driver that's your marketing spend, and let's say that you increase that marketing spend something like $500 a month, then the prediction of how many customers you're gonna get in the future becomes actually rather accurate because it's based on historical data and it's based on these drivers that you now understand. And that applies just the same if you were to cut your marketing budget. If this is a revenue driving variable, your marketing spend, and you reduce its budget, you can also estimate what the impact in customer acquisition could be, in this case, negative. Now, the point is that by looking at these drivers, by using this cause and effect thinking when running your estimations, you can start understanding what realistically can happen to your business in the coming months based on real data. And then you can apply this driver-based thinking really to any KPI your business has. That includes the other drivers, the indirect ones like PR, like SEO. Understanding those and estimating them is a little trickier, but remember our team has a financial modeling workshop that can help you get a better grip on those more custom metrics. Now, I want to get back to revenue, but let me talk about expenses too. There are two kinds of expenses that you need to be thinking about when you're doing this. First, you have costs, or cost of goods sold, COGS, and SG&A. Costs are expenses that are directly affected by your revenue. In other words, the more revenue you make, the more costs you have. For example, if you run a SaaS platform, your email tools and your hosting will be directly affected by revenue because the more customers you have, the more hosting fees you'll have to pay. If you run an e-commerce store, it's a lot easier. The cost of your goods is the items that you buy and then resell. Those are your COGS. Now, COGS will always scale with revenue. So in these diagrams, there's always a direct line, a direct cause and effect between revenue and COGS. And then when budgeting, what you need to understand is that your sales, your revenue will be the driver of your cost of goods sold. Now, the other big expense type your company might have are SG&A. Many sales, general, and administrative expenses are the drivers of your revenue. So they stand on the starting part of this workflow, on the left side. But there are also many other SG&A expenses that aren't really connected to anything. They're just ongoing costs your company might have, and then budgeting them can be a lot trickier. So let me give you one example of maybe office running costs, office expenses. In our case, office costs are this messy combination of utilities, office meals, we sponsor some Uber rides for the team. So how do you budget how this is going to look like in the future accurately? Now, the first thing that you'll need is some structure, and that's where a spreadsheet like this one will come in very handy. So this template is free, really, truly, completely free. We've been perfecting it since the pandemic started, and we suddenly had to get a lot better at budgeting. I'm going to link it below, and it's color-coded based on the diagrams that I've been showing you. So SG&A is always going to be blue, cost of goods sold are Slidebean red, and revenue is green. And again, with budgeting expenses, the key is understanding what the drivers of those expenses are. For example, what drives your office costs? It's not the revenue. It's generally the staff. The bigger the team, the bigger your office costs. And so I classify that scaling in these categories. First, manual, where there's no pattern and you're just better off inputting those values yourself. For example, legal costs and professional fees for consultants that you're hiring for specific things. Headcount-based, that's your utilities, or maybe tools like G Suite or ClickUp, where every new employee you add means an extra seat. And then revenue-based is also a possibility. Generally, revenue-based expenses should be COGS, right? But you might want to scale maybe your brand awareness budget with your revenue, even though one doesn't really drive the other. And last but not least, a 3-month average. This is useful for fluctuating expenses like travel that might jump up and down in a given month, but on an average should behave rather steadily. So let me show you how this looks. So for our workshop clients, what we normally do is teach them how to bring their P&L into the financial model and create these drop-downs that you can use to choose how you scale an expense. So essentially, what you can do here is if you paste the P&L, if you paste your actual data, right? So the model can import whatever historical numbers are already available and bring them over to SG&A. That's the past, right? That's a historical, it's easy to understand, it's easy to follow. But how do we predict for the future, right? In this case, advisory and professional services is a very highly fluctuating expense where you have months with as low as 7,000, but then as high as 42,000. So one way you could project this is manually, right? In the manual approach, what you do is you simply input the values of what you expect you're going to spend in the future, and the model just predicts for manual. That's fine, easy. Now, another way to scale it is on a 3-month average. So essentially what the 3-month average does is it takes the average of the last 3 months of average actual expenses and then projects that to the future, and then eventually just lands into a flat number because it's just an average of an average. You can scale that based on revenue, and then you can scale that based on headcount, depending on the number of people that you have. And when you do your homework, when you've mapped these expenses, when you've chosen your drop-downs, then your model, your projections, your budget can get really, really accurate about what's going to happen in the future. Budget and money stops being guesswork and it turns into these predictable revenue and predictable expenses. And then when you bring it all together, it can look something like this. The driver of your model may be your marketing budget or your sales team, but now you understand how those drivers affect the revenue and then what might happen in the future in regards to expenses. And you also get this clear understanding of the cost of serving any extra customer that you get. It's not just revenue that magically comes without the consequence of the additional expenses that you'll need to make to cover those costs and to cover those customers. At the same time, if you need to scale back, you can understand which expenses can be cut. You can understand runway, and you can make sure that you get your company to where it needs to be, that you get your funding and that the money lasts to where you need to be. That's your first job as CEO. These spreadsheets can be overwhelming, but your single most important task as the CEO of the company is not running out of money. Again, you can use this template for free as a starting point to run your own estimations. We've documented it thoroughly on our knowledge base, and if you need any of our team's help, you know where to find us. We'll see you next week.